funeral organizers of Reddit, what are the weirdest or most unique funerals you have organized? As a funeral music planner and organist, I've worked with families on many funerals to honor special requests. One was a Wizard of Oz themed funeral, where the deceased woman had loved the original movie and requested that music from it be used. Pallbearers and friends of the family dressed in costumes of the principal characters as they entered the church, including dozens of munchkins, Toto and the Witch. There wasn't a dry eye after the eulogy when the soloist sang Over the Rainbow, but many smiles as the coffin was carried out of the church en route to the cemetery as everyone sang We Are Off to See the Wizard, the Wonderful Wizard of Oz. I've been in the funeral industry for over 10 years now, and most services I have arranged have been run of the mill. Most people seem to want similar things, but one service will always stand out to me. A family asked us to play some hardcore gangster rap for their mother/grandmother at her service and we happily obliged. I can't quite remember the name of the song, but it had heavy themes of murder, drug use and pretty foul language. Her service was then finished with a recital of the Lord's Prayer. This lady was in her late 80s. When my grandfather died, we had a request we were afraid was odd, but the funeral director told us he'd seen much stranger, so it was okay. My grandfather was big into motorcycles. He had Harleys, as long as I can remember, and even after he had his hip surgery and the doctor told him not to ride anymore, he retooled his bike into a trike, so he could still ride. So after he died, my uncle outfitted the trike with a special rig, very secure and very safe, so that we could take him to the cemetery in his coffin on the back of the motorcycle. My uncle drove the motorcycle, while all the members of my grandfather's riding club circled him from the funeral parlor to the cemetery. It was badass and awesome, and I know my grandfather world loved it. I'm not a funeral organizer, but a control engineer. During a project I worked with a guy who did the crematorium oven systems, and he had some good stories. Story 1. A young guy died in a diving accident. His friends and family wanted him to be cremated in his diving suit. The crematorium guys told them they could not do this, but did not tell the reason. So the family decided to sneakily put his diving suit underneath his normal clothing to give their loved one a proper farewell. So, the core goes into the oven, the neoprene suit catches fire, and if you have ever seen a car tire fire you know what comes next. Picture the scene, a lovely bit of countryside with lush green fields, birds tweeting, elegant crematorium in the center, with huge black billowing clouds of smoke coming out of the chimney, to be seen and smelled all over the area. Whoops. The next obvious one is the sneaking of bottles of expensive whiskey in the pockets of the deceased, popular with the Indian population. I won't have to tell you that the combination of an 800°C oven and a bottle of 40% Volbooze is an exciting one. Best one was the story of the eco-friendly coffin. This crematorium had a system where the coffin during the ceremony would be lifted with 2 metal forks. The oven door opened, coffin gets inserted in the oven, door closes halfway, forks retract and the coffin, pressing against the door stays in the oven, and finally the door closes completely. Well, this system is perfect for wooden coffins, but this guy was into his environment etc. and had an eco-friendly coffin made of some type of recycled cardboard. The forks lift, the oven door opens, the forks slide in, the coffin disintegrates instantaneously when it meets the intense heat of the oven, the door lowers half, the forks retreat, taking the body back outside of the oven. Family and friends are distraught. Staff try with broomsticks to push the corpse back in the oven. Total chaos ensues. Not a funeral organizer, but one of my sisters was killed by a drunk driver, so as a family we were trying to figure out what to do for her funeral/memorial. She was cremated, so we had a lovely memorial at my dad's place outside and planted a couple of trees for her. My sister had a big personality in life and she loved to have fun and make people laugh. My other sisters and I decided that, rather than wear black, we would wear the most outrageous ball gowns we could get our hands on. Mine ended up being black with peacock feathers embroidered all over. One of my other sisters wore an enormous orange tutu. She would have absolutely loved it. It helped make the day a little less bitter and a little more sweet. A Viking funeral. Putting the ashes of the deceased out to sea in a little boat fashioned out of salt and covered with dry flour/kindling. Fashioning biodegradable arrows with flaming tips. Everyone shot flaming arrows at the boat, and it caught fire then dissolved into the sea. Now to be clear, Vikings never did any of this, but Hollywood gave people ideas. Apparently I'm not the first, but it was cool. Put the fun back in funeral. Late to the party, but I'll add my own. I'm not a funeral director, but a few years ago, when my grandmother died, miss you granny, my 2 sisters and 2 cousins were preparing her body for the viewing, as they were all cosmetologists. I should say that my family has a bit of a strange sense of humor, and for anyone that says this might be disrespectful, my granny would have laughed her ass off at this. So anyway, they are putting on all her makeup, and they are playfully arguing over how it should be done. Eventually, this escalated in them comparing their own makeup to what they were doing for granny. They were joking about who did the better job, and to get an accurate depiction, they were lying down next to the coffin, closing their eyes, and folding their arms on their chest, and the others would compare. They would then adjust both their own makeup and granny's to get it right. It was at this point that the funeral director walked in. He opened the door, saw my cousin lying on the floor, as though she was dead, with the others giddily adjusting granny's makeup, and using my dead cousin as a reference. There was an awkward pause for a few seconds before the girls all burst into laughter. The funeral director was visibly uncomfortable and silently left. After all was said and done, they went to apologize to the director, admitting that they were just having a bit of fun. He said it was alright, just a bit strange. He admitted that he did chuckle a bit as he was walking away. Fast forward to the service. A family friend was giving a eulogy and the girls are looking at granny up front in the coffin. They are trying to hold back smirks to each other, and a few people are noticing. They look to the back of the room, where the funeral director is standing. He flashes them a smirk himself, then closes his eyes and pulls his hands to chest to emit a dead person in a coffin. Apparently, it took everything they had to not burst out laughing on the spot. Former funeral director. Usually ran the back of the house, but met with families on a few occasions. Met with the parents of a 16-year-old girl who had died in a car crash. Arrangements were tough at first because how could they not be? We got the official stuff out of the way, and then talked about what she, the deceased, world wanted. Ended up rearranging the funeral home, so that the lobby had crock pots of boiled peanuts and a lounge with the Lion King playing. Inside the main parlor was a purple themed dance party. The pinnacle of the evening was the girl's mom leading everyone and doing the wiggle. It was amazing, and I'm still floored by this family for being able to really celebrate their daughter's life in this way. The piecemeal burials. My dad was a funeral director in a small town. One day, a guy called and said, "I'm going to be dropping off my foot this afternoon." He was like, "What?" The guy was diabetic and had to get his foot amputated. He had already purchased a burial plot in a local cemetery and wanted his foot to be buried there with the rest of him to follow eventually. Sure enough, the guy came in a wheelchair with a bug bundle containing his foot. He insisted that my dad embalm it. So, he did. It was then buried in his plot. About a year later, the guy calls up again. "I'm going to be bringing over my leg. I need you to embalm it and have it buried." Apparently his diabetes had continued to progress, and they had to amputate the leg opposite of the one that was missing its foot. So, my dad dutifully embalmed it and arranged for it to be buried. About another year or so goes by, and the man finally dies. My dad embalmed him and saw to it that he was buried with the rest of the parts which preceded him in death. Obligatory not a funeral director. A co-worker's father passed away. As I was getting to where he was laid out, I heard the voices of Jack Fleming and Mirren Cope calling Super Bowl likes, and I was immediately confused. I get to the main room of the funeral home, and my co-worker's father is laid out not in a suit, but as if he were ready for a Sunday afternoon of Steeler football. There was a TV on showing their first Super Bowl win, and all kinds of football memorabilia around. My co-worker said they wanted to lay his father out as they truly remembered him. First time I ever saw something like that at a funeral. I sang in a community choir with a man who was diagnosed with terminal cancer. This choir performed Handel's Messiah every year, and this man was our bass soloist on The People That Walked in Darkness Have Seen a Great Light. So, even though this choir didn't normally sing at church services, his dying request was that we come to his church for the funeral. The minister's text was "The people that walked and we were told to sing all his favorite hymns. While we were tearfully warming up on the day of, the choir director said he didn't specifically request it, but what if after the recessional, we surprised everyone by breaking into the Hallelujah chorus? As a reminder that we'll all be together again someday? So we did. We finished the requested recessional while the palbearers were recessing, and then burst into Hallelujah before the mourners left. Not a dry eye in the house. Obligatory not a funeral organizer. I had a friend that died. He was a musician, locally famous for all his TV performances, all liked. Great big fat guy we called Bacon. Lovely mate with lovely blues. He used to perform this one song very often, and it was obvious it should be played at his funeral, but we live in a boring, stiff, Catholic Orthodox country, and the funeral is more about the religious ceremony than the actual dead person getting their goodbyes. The priest wouldn't allow any song that wasn't religious to be played at the funeral, so a bunch of friends basically went and hijacked the whole ceremony. They turned up the speakers and played his song loud and clear for everyone to hear, and everyone besides the priest was content. His children were really small back then and probably didn't understand a lot, but I'm glad they got a memory of that song associated with their father forever. He died of leukemia. Fuck priests. Not a funeral director, but when my great uncle passed away, his last request was to have his ashes scattered on the same mountain my grandpa is scattered on. The way he wanted it done though is the weird part. He wanted his ashes put in a plastic bag, hung in a large pine tree, and then have everyone shoot it open with shotguns. Only 3 family members actually shot, but 3 shotgun blasts simultaneously shredding a plastic bag full of human ashes. Pretty wild. Kinda like one of those gender reveal balloons. My great uncle was a weird man. Not a funeral director, but I'm hired frequently to play violin at funerals. Not sure it qualifies as weird, but it was definitely unique. Woman died in her late 80s. Her entire family was there, including 3 or 4 great grandkids even. She had a big family and was well liked in her community, so there was about 100 to 150 people there. Everyone was dressed super nice, and from talking to everyone, it was clear no one knew what was coming. Turns out, their grandmother was a huge Lotta fan. So, she had a Lord of the Rings themed funeral, with me playing concerning hobbits, Gandalf's fall, and the like. It was fun, but the shock on everyone's faces was hilarious. Not a funeral director, but this is what we did with my grandmother. She was supposed to have a Jewish funeral, but was accidentally embalmed when she died. So then it was decided by the family to have her cremated. Double negative, I guess. Every year my family goes to the same beach, and that year my aunt brought the ashes. Without telling or asking anyone, my cousins and I took about half of her ashes and put them in a handful of tiny plastic baggies and then taped said baggies to a bunch of bottle rockets. We then gathered the family at the beach and set off the fireworks over the ocean immediately after telling the family about the ashes, but that we left half of them behind. No one was mad, and it was agreed by all that she would have loved knowing she went out with a bang. Not a funeral director, but thought I'd share. My dad passed away in January. He always joked about wanting popcorn kernels in his pockets when he was cremated. So, my siblings and I decided to get 4 1-pound bags of kernels and pour them all over him in his cremation box. We also split a Miller High Life, his beer of choice, in his honor, and placed that with him as well. The funeral director put our dad into the furnace and closed the door. Seconds later he hurried us over so we could hear the popping of the popcorn. It was surreal. At the viewing, everyone was allowed a Miller High Life before the service began, because that's what he would have wanted. The funeral procession was led by a semi-truck, since my dad was an over-the-road driver. When my father was interred, the semi drove through the cemetery parking lot and out onto the street honking his horn the whole way to honor him. Not in the funeral industry, but the guys who helped with my family friend's funeral said they had never seen anything like it. He had worked in theater since he was a teen, and everyone he knew was theater people. We got to use his first theater for the funeral, and everyone who was a technician wore their work blacks. He was buried in his too. Several actors and musicians performed poems and fitting music, and we sent him with a curtain close. It was heart-wrenching as he had young kids, but it was the perfect funeral for him. A cousin of mine killed himself several years ago, and his service had no religion whatsoever, and was just family and friends speaking about him. As someone who doesn't do religion myself, it was so nice not to have all that thrown in. My childhood doctor's funeral ended nice. Everyone sang his favorite song, When the Saints Go Marching In. I much prefer going to the viewing the night before. There isn't as much sadness and you can mingle. So this is not a weird thing that happened, it's rather the community. I'm not an organizer myself, but my dad is, and I help out sometimes. I'm living in Germany and we have some kind of remainder of the Third Reich called Reichsbürger. Just Google them, some crazy people. So usually they are distributed, but for their comrade who recently passed they gathered together to about 50 people. It was so surreal that something like this still exists and is even allowed to do so. I didn't know about this before, and I think I'll never forget about it. Not a funeral director, it was my own grandpa's funeral. Grandpa had very clearly stated this one specific preacher he wanted. I'd met this guy before, and it was very clear he had early signs of dementia, but that's who Grandpa wanted. He got up there, and the funeral, and started complaining about everything from cell phones, unions, gay people, elevators and how beautiful women are. I literally think he forgot he was at a funeral, because he didn't mention my grandpa once. It was a really upsetting, and he contradicted a lot of my grandpa's strongly held beliefs. Not an organizer but a musician. I played for a funeral for a fallen RCMP officer. There were 6 uniformed officers standing behind me as I played music for the service. One of the officers stood right behind me and read the lyrics off my sheet music as he sang. It was distracting, but in a good way. It was a nice service. Mostly police and medical emergency crew attended. I kind of have a thing for uniforms. The most memorable was playing for my auntie's funeral. The church was full to the capacity with over 400 people. When asked to perform a solo, I didn't dare look up until I was finished. When I did, I gasped. There were people lined up because all the pews were full. People were lined up in the hall and outside. The entire church was listening to the music and many had their eyes closed. Seeing my dad and mum watch me as they cried nearly broke my heart. Hardest thing I ever had to do. Even playing at my mum's funeral wasn't as hard.